Welcome to the June 4th AI update for the AIX Higher Ed podcast. So we're following a lot of rapid iteration in AGI and movement towards AGI and more of those discussions.
And, here we have the newest release of Claude Opus 4.8, and it's almost exactly 6 weeks after the release of 4.7, which was a bit after 6 weeks after 4.6. So now we're seeing, improvements in the models coming out, basically every 6 weeks. As Alice Wisner Gross said on the Moonshots podcast recently, we're, kind of on a rapid pace to the singularity, which, is another way to kind of define AGI. But regardless of how, whether AGI or not, we're just seeing these rapid iterations. And if you're using them, you can just kind of really feel and see the difference between the model releases. And here, we're talking about this. This was a talk just given at Oxford by one of the co-founders of Anthropic, saying they expect by 2028 that you will have full recursive self-improvement, where the AI is not just kind of building the AI like it's doing now. It's kind of largely directed by humans, but where it's kind of saying this is what needs to come next. The AI is figuring that out. It's going out, it's writing the code, it's doing the test, bringing it to fruition, and then advancing on its own into the next stage. So if that does happen in 2028 or really anywhere near that time frame, that's it's going to change everything.
It's going to be a lot more discussion about self-recursive improvement because I think that's something that a lot of the labs are building toward, and we're going to hear more and more about it.
We continue to see, like, as we've been saying, some more progress towards AGI. We just saw the ARC AGI 3 test, which it kind of tests whether the models can learn in real time. And, there's barely anything there. They're like at 0.5%. So now it's like 1.5% with Claude Opus 4.8. So somebody said, oh, they tripled. It's like, okay, well, you tripled. It's just a minor improvement. But, I saw this in a recent post by Dr. Ben Gortz, who wrote one of the original books on AGI, really helping to define the concept and thinking about it. And he mentioned in this post that his father was a sociologist, and he's actually working on a book with his father. And Ben's in his 60s, so his father's probably in the late 80s, maybe 90 plus years old. And they're writing a book called AGI Nation, which kind of unpacks kind of the societal implications of AGI. So, just kind of really hits that this is becoming real, and we're starting to see these discussions even in social media and journal articles that are being published.
Then we move to stories about what's going on with some of these major companies and the fundraising, first starting with the IPO stories. Of course, there's a lot of coverage about this. And what was really breaking the last several days is that Anthropic confidentially filed an S1 with the SEC, which allows them to move toward an IPO. And this was soon after they had a recent valuation of some $965 billion. There's a suggestion that they might even have a valuation of $1.75 trillion. It could be up along the lines of what SpaceX is promising to have. Now, SpaceX will be the first, but there was a lot of speculation about whether or not OpenAI or Anthropic was going to be able to come second. There is some concern that maybe there's not enough money out there to fund all of these at the levels they're looking for. I'm not so sure about that. I think there'll be plenty of money to fund these IPOs, but it looks like Anthropic will have the next one, and they've already leapfrogged over OpenAI in terms of the preliminary valuation. We'll see if that persists as they continue to have new models roll out and new capabilities as they get ready for their IPO. Then also the story on the right is about what Alphabet is doing, and this is Sundar Pichai, of course, CEO, talking about raising $80 billion from stock sales in order to fund further AI build out. And they want to make sure that they're able to have the infrastructure and the support that they need to be able to meet demand, not only external demand, but also internal demand, because they have so many different capacities and labs within Google that are doing things working toward AI and AGI.
The only thing I was going to comment there is, say maybe they won't have the money, but, people are going to sell other investments and put the money in here. And, that could obviously create kind of some ripple effects within the economy. But the other thing too, we're talking about Anthropic maybe having like a $1.4 trillion valuation. SpaceX has been around for a while. It's launched as many satellites as basically all the countries in the world combined over the period of time. And their IPO will be around 1.7 trillion. So the Anthropic, well over $1 trillion anywhere in that thing. This is a company, right, that's not that old. It's only really started releasing a product not even a couple years ago, and now getting their ARR up. So the fact that they're even in the ballpark of where SpaceX and combined with XAI is really incredible.
Yeah. Now, moving on to some discussion of robotics developments.
Jensen Huang is saying that the robotics market is worth $45 trillion. I think the whole entire global economy is like, I forget, it's 100 trillion or $200 trillion. So it's like 25 or 50% of the global economy. And, they are expecting it to replace some labor, especially labor like in confined spaces, in factories and warehouses, and those types of things. But, it's just like an astronomical claim, but, is backed by reason. And, here I kind of love this. I saw it. I spent a lot of time in New York City. There's a company called Shift. They'll send a humanoid robot to clean your apartment and it's free, but on the condition that they could film everything. And they'll say that, they'll delete anything that's, personally identifiable or whatever when they're done. But they're just trying to train the robots on everything that, a cleaner would do, so then we can have cleaning robots. And, it's interesting. We're just trying to record everything that people can do so we can replicate everything. And then, we have the, NVIDIA there is part of their, they're doing a lot in robotics, right? Jim Fan, one of the, I guess, probably kind of world famous roboticist who oversees a lot of this. They're developing more of these world models. Faye Faley sent out a Substack about this today, just kind of explaining the significance of the world models and the ability, instead of just, relying on text. We've talked about this in other before. Instead of just relying on text to kind of understand the world, you can see the world, you can reason about the world through these physical descriptions. And, some of the scientists like her and Yan LeCun are saying that this will be absolutely essential to AGI, but they're heavily invested in it.
Now, there's also reports that, of course, OpenAI has not given up on robotics. They're hiring. Sam Altman posted this just at the end of May, talking about how they're looking for machine learning engineers, full stack hardware experts to be able to build out OpenAI robotics. This is going to continue to be another horse race, another aspect of AI that's going to be built out. Another story related to the build out and developments in a lot of the technology is Meta looking for ways to be able to have other products, not just the glasses, but also some discussions of an AI pendant. We heard about that before. We've seen that other companies have tried this and has been that successful, but probably has more to do with whether or not people are ready for it. And maybe they are. Maybe the backlash will prevent some people from being comfortable with it. But I think there are a lot of companies, Apple included, that we've heard that are looking at different ways to find hardware that can be incorporated into day-to-day life that will bring AI into the user's life. Now, this story is kind of continuing what Stefan was talking about with NVIDIA. They also came out with an announcement that they're entering the PC market. And so they've the RTX Spark. It's their first PC chip for personal, laptop computer. They typically are working at the level of data centers and working on much bigger platforms. But being able to incorporate this into a laptop might allow for you to be able to do a lot more with OpenClaw running it on your own machine, being able to run a lot of other agents and a lot of other tools.
They have a new tool that they'll figure out like which model you need to use, and not just kind of the commercial models in terms of the ones that you have to subscribe to, right? That you're generating the inference, offsite, but local models, open models that you can run on your machine. If that'll work for the task that's being done, you can use that. So it's kind of a thinking machine that kind of does the work for you in terms of which model you need.
Now, this is a story that we've talked about quite a bit over the years. We have leaders of OpenAI and also Anthropic that have had fairly apocalyptic visions of what's going to happen to the job markets. Now, both of them are walking it back a little bit. Now, some of it might be because they're worried about their IPOs. They don't want to scare the markets too much. They want to indicate that there is a way that they can grow without scaring the broader community and the rest of the world. Maybe there is also some truth to their claims that they've looked at it and they realize there's some different elements at work in the job market, that they're finding that it's not just going in and replacing positions, but actually serving in a complementary way and be able to increase productivity. There are a lot of different explanations for this, but it is pretty telling that it's happening right now as they're both working on the IPOs for OpenAI and Anthropic.
I always love the kind of the conspiracy, oriented angles to the story, right? Because people said, oh, when they're talking about how everyone's going to lose their jobs, they were saying, well, this is just hype because, they want to sell their products and get investment. Now, when they're walking back kind of their job claims, people are like, well, you're just saying that because you're going to IPO. So, it's unclear kind of what we're going to leave this, but as kind of OpenAI prepares to go public and, maybe gets this like $1 trillion valuation, the OpenAI Foundation, the nonprofit, owns 25% of the company. So we're looking at kind of the basically the largest foundation in the world. It used to be the oil monarchies that had these enormous foundations, but here we have one maybe with potentially $250 billion.
Now, moving on to some discussion about developments at university level with policies and also responses. And this first one is looking at UC Berkeley Law having a policy where the use of AI is prohibited, and they can't students aren't allowed to upload course materials, including their reading, slides, class recordings, any other content into generative AI systems. Really interesting because at this point, almost every major law firm is incorporating generative AI and expecting students to know how to use generative AI. There is some understandable tension because, of course, Berkeley Law is wanting to make sure students are developing the skills that they think are important for somebody to practice law. But this also runs pretty counter to what those same lawyers are going to be expected to do when they get out into the workforce.
Yeah, and I mean, it also just runs counter to like how students are starting to learn, right? Like when they're actually learning their material, they're taking and they're uploading it into the AIs to help them study. Notebook LM, a lot of the students are using for that, and they find it's really helpful to studying. And the other thing that just really stood out to me about that particular policy was to say you can't even use it to brainstorm. It's just so extreme, right? That it kind of almost the credibility of the policy collapses. Like, how are you going to know if they talk to the AI about whatever it is they're studying or working on, just as if you and I were both in law school and we talk to each other, right? Like there's no thing there. But, then you have the University of Chicago, it's kind of heading in the opposite direction.
And this discussion about AI tools at the University of Chicago has had a real impact on discussions within the higher ed community because it's a fairly strident move. The highlighted text at the bottom is something that a lot of people have referenced, that instructors at all levels are navigating a fast evolving landscape, and the university has a duty of care to ensure that the education offered to you is responsive to these technological developments by teaching you how to think with machines. So imagine somebody that goes to the University of Chicago, one of the top universities in the country, if not the world, and then they go to Berkeley Law, and as an undergraduate, they're encouraged to use it, taught how to use it, and they get to Berkeley and they're told, nope, you're not allowed to use it at all. What's interesting about this is that it just shows that we're at a point where every institution is recognizing they have to be able to take a stand on what the role for AI is going to be in education at their institution. I don't know that some of these positions are going to last very long, and they probably aren't going to be very well defended. But you have to recognize. I have some respect for the fact that they're developing this. I would think at this point, though, that a school like Berkeley would have a little, maybe a more nuanced understanding of the kinds of policies, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in Chicago because that's a fairly strident position. And when we get into the story about what was going on at San Jose State University and the California state systems, dealings with OpenAI, there has been a lot of controversy about whether or not that was a mistake. And so the Wall Street Journal has the story. There have been some other stories about this as well that have said that the $17 million that they paid OpenAI has been incredibly controversial with staff, with a lot of students, certainly with taxpayers, because it was also spent at a time where they had a budget crisis. And they just announced recently that they're going to continue the deal with OpenAI to have all the California state system schools, the students and the staff and the faculty have access to ChatGPT. So, there are some concerns that maybe Chicago is going to have a similar problem when they're talking about rolling this out with Claude or other companies working with other universities. It's an uneven playing field, in part because there's so much contention from faculty and students about whether or not they want to use AI or whether or not they want to encourage the use of AI. But at the same time, there's a growing recognition that they really need to learn. I mean, it's our responsibility to teach students about AI AI at the very least. And so this tension is not something that's going to be resolved very quickly or very easily. But these are certainly stories that we need to follow, both extremes, looking at it in terms of the controversy about having that kind of a deal, schools like Berkeley saying it's banned, schools like Chicago saying that it's encouraged, and then so many of the schools that fall in the middle, not really sure exactly what to do and leaving it up to instructors. I had a discussion with some colleagues the other day about this, and we were kind of lamenting the poor state of affairs for incoming first year students. It's you're getting ready to walk through a minefield. Every instructor has a different policy. Every syllabus has a different policy. Even for the same class, you'll have different policies or acceptance rates for the use of AI tools dependent upon assignments. And it's because most of the instructors and most schools just are kind of feeling their way through this, even though it's been around for 3 years. We kicked the can down the road as far as we could, and now we're going to have to reckon with it. And it's an important time for us to be a little more honest with ourselves and with our students about what our responsibility really is. I think Chicago's got it right that we do have this burden, this responsibility that we should be providing students with this opportunity and this kind of education. But it's probably easier said than done, certainly.
And it's really coming at the time where, generative AI is just, getting a lot better, right? Just in terms of kind of the accuracy, which is the way it would always challenge, right? All the professors wanted to turn the students into fact checkers, but now the agents are starting to work pretty well. And we have new agents coming out from Gemini. Microsoft released an agent today at Build. We have Hermes in the Open Cloud, and, so it's just like a whole other level of AI that, faculty aren't even aware of. But, I've been sending you some screenshots kind of back and forth about this a lot, but you just see there's a lot of, if you're on kind of social media now, even just like LinkedIn, kind of more professional social media, there's a lot of, questioning, right? About, okay, what is, is a huge debate. I've seen some animosity towards University of Chicago's decisions today. So that's kind of one factor of debate. The second factor is like, hey, wait a minute, like, all our assignments, right? They're in trouble, and some people react like, "Well, this means there aren't any more assignments." I posted that today. Even if it's true, right? Even if we just spot the argument that the AIs kind of undermine the paper, there are other ways of assessing and teaching and learning that we can take advantage of, and I think some of that gets lost. But other people are just starting to question, well, what is the role of the university in a world where there's obviously lots of issues that we continually talk about, debts, all these types of things. It's more difficult to get a job, wages are low. What are we teaching? What's the relevance of this? I saw Chicago, somebody posted like, this is so bad because their entire curriculum, and I don't know if this is true, but it's just what somebody said, their entire curriculum is kind of focused on reading all these great books and thinking, and now you're going to do it with AI. And it's like, well, the times have changed regardless of whether that way of doing things was great like 10 years ago or even 5. So there's just a lot of people, they're writing Substack articles, they're posting on LinkedIn, they're posting in other places. We both have friends who even just post on Facebook. You are professors, you can just see their frustrations. And I think a lot of it's starting to build. And the better and better the AI gets, in a way, the more frustrated they're going to get. 2 years ago, they were all posting like, well, this AI is garbage, and that's what they were annoyed about, that it didn't work really well. Now it's working really well, and they're even more annoyed because it's having a greater impact on the learning and the instruction.
But at the same time, there are some academics that are recognizing there is a role for generative AI in their research. And, here are a couple of examples that Stefan has shared that we've talked a bit about. The first is Terence Tao. Of course, we've talked about a very world famous mathematician talking about how AI can reshape math research because it can allow for this different kind of division of labor, and the kind of automation that AI can allow for will allow human mathematicians to be able to do better work. And we're also finding, as we've talked about in previous weeks, that generative AI tools are being able to develop novel solutions to some of these problems that have been longstanding. Then you have the screenshot from the right, which I really enjoyed looking at this. And it was something that was shared by somebody from a former colleague at the University of Washington. But it was from a senior faculty member that was sending a message to all the PhD students that they should consider using GPT Pro 5.5 in their research, because they found that the work with GPT 5.5 was so good at finding connections that had taken this senior researcher months or years to figure out on their own. It could really expedite that process. And so there are good examples where it could be used responsibly, and it could be used very productively to forward academic research. And it's not always just a concern that it's going to de-skill or it's going to undercut the quality or, the really the whether or not it's authentic research. But that tension is going to continue. I think the other thing that's going to be really complicated with this as we get a little later in this update is the story about the backlash. I'm afraid that's going to embolden a lot of our colleagues that are really anti-AI to say, look, there is a backlash societally. There are going to be reasons why it's not going to be allowed to develop in society. So we don't need to do it in academia. There are good examples why there's a good affirmative case to be made for incorporating it, not just a response to societal uses. But in addition to that, it really is a responsibility that we prepare our students for a world. And increasingly, it's a world that's dependent upon AI. This story, you might have seen that there are more pushback from sources like CNN and, of course, the New York Times talking about the brazen theft of news. And there are a number of new different lawsuits that are coming up against Perplexity and continuing against OpenAI and to other companies as well. These are companies, traditional companies that are really trying to resist to make sure that they can be repaid for what can be lost. This is something that we've seen go on for the last year and a half, 2 years, if not longer, as an ongoing discussion about the use of creative content and copyrighted content. That's something that still has to be resolved legally. And it's going to be interesting to see how that gets resolved and what they're going to do with it. One area of that, of course, is in Hollywood. And I'll let Stefan talk a little bit about some of the developments in this area.
Yeah, there's just, a lot of kind of more developments. There's the Tilly Norwood, the actress, right, who's really kind of taking over Hollywood. There's another person there who's like, okay, I'm going to really increase my investments in AI. I've kind of come around and I've kind of come to the conclusion that this is going to be an important part of kind of filmmaking and, all types of, shows, those types of things, commercials, right? It's all going to be there. And Amazon is also developing kind of its animated service. So just like we're seeing, and the trends are similar, right? First, kind of AI kind of came for the writers in a way, right? That was the first way that people kind of started using it. Then it kind of came for the coders. It got better at coding. We could talk about that. Code.org just changed it to their name to codeai.org, right? So we'll have a slide on that, but that happened this week. The mathematicians, they're seeing it can do more and more math. And there was some math association recently published this letter about, AI is not so great at math, and people are saying, well, they're just kind of upset. And now we see it kind of coming for the creatives, right? So is it kind of rolls into each area and it gets better? Like I say, originally it was like, well, AI can't do this, and people kind of criticized it for that. Now it's like, well, AI can do this, and the criticism is increasing. The music, right? The music generators are just kind of getting so good. 11 Labs, their music generator. We've seen Suno this week too. They got another $400 million investment. So in one of their rounds. So just really kind of technology is getting powerful.
This is a continuation of that, looking at Suno. We've talked a little bit about this before. They're raising funding with a $5.4 billion valuation. And, there are interesting developments where they're finding new partnerships. Even Spotify is allowing, they're testing out possibilities for people to do karaoke with copyrighted music using AI. There are a lot of developments like this. And we just kind of see it chipping away. And it's I'm not really sure exactly how that's all going to be resolved, other than I think that most of these companies are going to be able to continue doing this work. There's so much money involved that it's difficult to see any regulatory agency rolling that back.
Yeah, and it's just happening. Nothing is really stopping it. And then we see here, continuation of the consciousness debate.
Yeah. And Jeffrey Hinton was interviewed by Andrew Marr, who is the host of Leading Britain's Conversation. And in this, Andrew Marr asked, do you think that consciousness has perhaps already arrived inside AI? And Jeffrey Hinton said, yes, I do. And so there's a continuing discussion about what does that really mean? We've seen several stories like this recently where we have some major figures that are saying maybe there is some consciousness there. At least we can't discount it the way that we did before. And this is not going to be a bright line. It's not going to be easy to be able to tell, but this is kind of the early signs that I think we're going to continue to, obviously, of course, have these conversations. But I think more and more people will start to realize there's more going on there than just a sarcastic parrot, certainly. And more than just predicting the next word, there's an understanding, there's a reflexivity that it's hard to explain with traditional understandings of large language models.
Yeah, and I always kind of just love too. There, people, um, they kind of it is kind of almost religious, and it's fine, right? And it's not like I'm criticizing religion, but they don't really have like a lot of arguments. I mean, you have to really understand, right, how these things are working to really have a qualified opinion as to whether or not it's conscious or not. And someone like Jeff Hinton, basically one of the main inventors of this technology. Like when people understand it and have studied it their whole lives, they're like, "Oh, Jeff Hinton says it might be conscious." People are like, "Oh, that's ridiculous. That guy doesn't know anything he's talking about," right? And they're posting on social media. And I just kind of approach it like, okay, I don't really qualify to have my own opinion, but I see that reasonable, very well qualified people disagree. So I think it's possible. And, again, and today, again, like, we're just kind of pushing on the size of the changes that are coming. And we saw that Anthropic, all right, is hiring a member. They like to say member of the staff or member of the technical staff, right? And this is not technical, but it's about AI and the rule of law. They want to study how AI is going to impact the rule of law and how it's going to impact democracy. It's part of kind of their public interest things that they fund, just like kind of the potential impact on employment. So this is another area where we're starting to see that AI kind of is and potentially will impact society. And I just want to say quickly too, I saw an interview with Mustafa Suleyman today, right? Chief of AI basically at Microsoft, who's in charge of their new models. And somebody was asking him, "Well, aren't you kind of behind? There's these other labs." And he's like, "Oh, we're a little behind. We're catching up." He's like, "But we don't understand that like right now, only 1% of the world is using AI." So he's like, there's more than enough room for kind of everybody to play in. We're only seeing the very beginning of how this is going to kind of integrate into society or impact society, right? So when you look and you say, well, the rule of law, the rule of law hasn't been really that changed by AI yet. We basically only have 1% of AI penetration, and that's at the current ability levels of the AI, let alone kind of the escalating abilities of the AI. Then when you even get to 5, 10, 20%, 30% of society and the economy, you're looking at huge changes.
And of course, one aspect of that is the backlash, as we've talked about frequently over the last several months, even over the last year or so. You see this building for a number of reasons. At Harvard's graduation, they had for class a day Ronnie Chang from The Daily Show talking about it was Harvard's responsibility. It was the students' responsibility to destroy AI, and the graduates started cheering. Of course, we've had the stories about some of the graduates booing other speakers who've talked about AI, even just referencing it as an industrial revolution. And we are also going to see more and more of this being tied into political discussions as some of the top spenders for the midterms are PACs that are associated with AI companies, with high tech. They're pushing for lower regulations in most cases, different kinds of regulations. And at the same time, there's growing fear and worry about what this is going to mean for the economy. That is something that's just going to get messier, I'm afraid, at the same time that we're trying to resolve, or we really need to be able to have open, honest discussions. The backlash doesn't help. And anybody just digging their heels in, that doesn't help either. I think that when you do hear a leader of an AI company that is fairly open about understanding the rationales, and then they're empathetic with people that are opposed, I think there are many people in the AI industry that are also concerned and they're also very resistant. But they've also accepted that if we don't do it and we don't do it well, somebody else will do it and they won't do it so well. This is a discussion that we need to have. We need more public arguments, certainly, and we need to make sure that people feel open and have the opportunity to engage in that. This kind of backlash isn't going to allow that, though. And discussions about data center tax breaks, worries about the environment, worries about the economy, it's only going to, I'm not sure when it'll come to a head, but it's certainly going to continue to grow.
And the one thing positive here, as I've been doing a little talking about data centers, is I'm glad that Ohio suspended the tax break. All right, these data center companies, they should have to pay taxes. They have the resources. They should be making positive contributions to the community. This never should have occurred. And maybe it did initially to draw in some things, but I'm glad they're getting rid of the tax breaks, and I'm glad that they'll be contributing to the community in a positive way. And kind of as an extension of the backlash, and you see this stuff coming, Bernie Sanders wrote this article, I think it was in the New York Times, that basically wants the government to take 50% ownership of the companies. So we can get some profits, and we can kind of redistribute those to the public. I don't think it's kind of a really a terrible idea, like as a concept, right? Like it could like kind of fund universal basic income, those types of things. But as Dr. Ben Goertzel said, we referenced earlier, right, his book that he was writing with his dad, AGI Nation. That's where I saw it in this article. You can check it out. But he talks in here about, hey, well, we got to, hold back here like a little bit. That in the AI space, everything's advancing like very quickly. There are a lot of there are AI labs that, very powerful and profitable. But he said, even that story's not written. He said, we're just at the beginning of this. There are people building distributed AI systems like himself. Like once AI starts to be able to self-replicate, who knows if these top labs are going to be able to control it. There's millions of models that are being distributed. Some industry is using, their own like localized models. He's like, hey, this is all taking off. It's at least going pretty well in terms of the takeoff. We don't need the government to jump in right now and just say, well, we're going to regulate you in this particular way. And he just said, in the West, the U.S. In particular, all the regulations are just highly influenced by lobbyists, and they want regulatory capture and all these kind of things. So I think he kind of makes a compelling point of like, well, do we really want the government, I mean, this is a pretty heavy-handed piece of legislation here, right? To take 50% ownership, of the company. So, I think that, but you're seeing, I think in the in the context, people are getting nervous. And Bernie Sanders, he'll talk about a lot about job loss. Like he thinks a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. He's afraid of this, right? And obviously, there's a lot of economic dissatisfaction, independent of whether or not you can blame it on AI. People kind of feel financially insecure. You have a kind of a growing rich-poor gap. There's a lot of uncertainty in the economy. Even just stuff like gas prices, rising gas prices, generally contributing to economic anxiety. And I think he's a good person, right? He has a good heart, and he's kind of thinking like, well, what can we do about this? And we always kind of see government as kind of the savior, so to speak, right? They can come in and fix everything. I just don't know that this is the fix, but it's emerging out of this context, right? Which we kind of unpacked a little bit, right? That it's coming after the mathematicians, the coders, right?
Sure, but let me play devil's advocate this a
Yeah.
little bit. It sounds pretty audacious, take over ownership of half of it. At the same time, we've had some discussions about the federal government perhaps nationalizing some of these companies or taking control of them so that they can really manage the content and what actually is being done. You've also heard leaders of most of these companies pledge that they will support a universal basic income or universal basic services. The founders of Anthropic have said that they've made the commitment that they will give 80% of the value to some type of good societal goodwill to be able to provide something. I don't know that the scale is even that far off from what eventually we're going to see the need for. And I'm not sure that it's as bad an idea as some of the others, or much worse than many of the others. I think the other concern with it, though, and one of the pushbacks that we're hearing, and as you were outlining, I think articulating well, is the concern that it's not really the government to come in and to be able to start managing that. But there are some of the leaders of these companies that I would rather almost any government manage it than those individuals, because those individuals are not necessarily, they're being fairly disingenuous in the way that they talk about what their interests are for broader society, or whether or not they're really concerned about, job loss or societal disruption. There has to be something in the middle. There has to be a better way of going about it than just doing something that's fairly ham-handed like this. But this is just, we're in early innings. And I remember saying this 2.5 years ago, that we were recognizing with all of this, we're in early innings with political discussions. We're in very early discussions about what that could look like. I don't think they should just take over half ownership over the companies, but doing it that way might actually be a way to incentivize continued growth, because those people that own the company still own the other half. And we're talking about growing at such a rate, as you mentioned before, Anthropic, company that's around 5 years, and they're going to have an IPO of probably close to 1.5 trillion or more. That's far more than you would ever expect an IPO or a company to be able to do. And they're growing at an incredible clip. I mean, they've had 80 times growth over a short period of time. So, I don't think the scale is even that audacious. I think that we have to have some discussions, though, about how do you take all of this incredible wealth that is going to be generated. Everybody talks about we'll get to an age of abundance, and it's great to see what that looks like. how do we get there? It's the transition that I'm more worried about than anything else. And these types of proposals could allow for that transition to occur. If you just leave it to individual companies to be able to amass their wealth and hold on to it while they're disrupting the economy, then I think we're in for a world of hurt. But if there's a way that we could manage it between private industry and the government to be able to say we have to distribute some of this, to be able to make sure that we can minimize some of the disruption, or to be able to allow a transition for people. So Bernie Sanders' proposal, sure, it's not ideal. It's not a great idea, but we've got to get the ball rolling in terms of discussing what this is going to look like.
Yeah, I would just say quickly, I mean, one thing, OpenAI, like you said, $250 billion kind of foundation, right? So you have a little bit of it there. I do think, though, to your point, like things are going to change a lot, right? So the government doing something radical, like, maybe getting 50% of the take of these companies, maybe in a new economy, right? That's part of the box. It'll be pretty hard for them to nationalize it, because if they just nationalized it, these people aren't steel workers. They don't need the job, right? All these people, in these these top labs, they've already made their millions, if not billions. So they can leave, but it's going to get complicated. But I think it is definitely worth discussing some out of the box pictures, because too, I wouldn't assume the government's like a benevolent actor. I saw an article today about all the people in the Trump administration, how much money they were going to make when OpenAI go IPOs, because they're all heavily invested in OpenAI, and you don't really even need to be that heavily invested, given the returns that people are going to get out of this, right? So there's a lot of kind of maybe conflicting interests. We're not really sure. Dwarkesh Patel kind of put that out, even about government regulation. Well, who do you want regulating what can come out?
Yeah, certainly. I don't think government regulation is an answer to this. But if you think of something along the lines of what Bernie Sanders is recommending, it's not a tax that's continually taxed. It's not just taking money, but by taking ownership over part of it, or taking some stock portion of what that company is worth, there's still an incentive for the company to grow.
Yeah.
And it allows for continued growth for whatever those funds then can be used for. So maybe this is, you have them give a certain percentage of the companies, or maybe the overall NASDAQ, to be able to fund Social Security or the equivalent of that. How else are we going to be able to get the money from it? There's no way taxation is going to work in this political climate. Having something like this, look, there are a lot of problems with it, but this is actually better than some of the others. And just to think that people are going to be benevolent, and that you're going to take people that are trying to become trillionaires, and they're going to all of a sudden be willing to hand over hundreds of billions of dollars a year, that's just not likely. Even OpenAI's foundation, they do have 25% listed there, and that's because of the structure of the company. They're not going to just start handing out money to people. They're using that for further research, and there will be an agenda associated with it. So whichever way we go with it, you have to worry about who would be doing the regulating, who's going to be making the decisions. And instead of a backlash, I just hope that the American public starts getting involved to discuss what the next step should be and what they would like to see happen with some of these companies. Because I think the companies would be some of them would be willing to meet people halfway.
Yeah, just quickly, I saw a podcast. Well, I fell asleep listening to it, but one of the first questions was like, when in history have the wealthiest people just voluntarily redistributed their wealth to people of less means? And the answer is never.
Doesn't happen. Yep.
The big things to think about here.
Yep. Well, that brings us to the end of this week's update. We'll continue to follow these stories. There were so many others that we weren't able to get to. Stefan's going to include them in his Substack. And if you have suggestions or ideas, please send them our way. We would love to hear about what you'd like to hear about. And we'll be back next week with our next update. Thanks, Stefan.
Thank you, Anand.